Welcome to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast.
It is a delight to be here, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, listeners heard at the top of the show that this isn't your typical widow story, maybe that you might have heard on this show or other places. And we are going to dive deep and wide into your story, which you've captured so. I was trying to think of the words I was saying to you before the show. If you're watching on YouTube or a clip, you can see the cover. It's called The Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards. And of course, I immediately was like, I need to know more about this title. And also Jessica's probably my people but it's not just that your story's not so different, by the way, than probably many listeners, but often of the stories told by widows or about widows. I think that's the unique piece there. But the way you write with such brave honesty and of course wit, and the way you weave storytelling past and present and take us back is so profound. I was sort of also taking mental notes as a future memoirist. I was like, this is how it's done. So we're going to say it many times in the show. You all know, check out the show notes to get the link to pick yourself up a copy of the book. So we're going to talk all about the book and your story and some of the themes, again, that we don't often talk about around in widowhood, around trust and betrayal and empathy and forgiveness and anger. There's a particular passage in there, you talking with your therapist around anger, that I thought was really profound. I want to talk about. And then the healing journey you've been on and the things that you've tried. And we're going to dive deep and wide, as we always do on this show. But Jessica, of course, you know, because you shared your listener to the show, I want to start with inviting you to share an early memory of loss so that we might get to know what was an early grief belief that you had based on how your parents or other adults in your life modeled grief? And what do you think that taught you, positively, negatively, neutrally, about entering this particular loss that we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so my earliest grief memory is, and I say this with full respect, and I know that you say this all the time, like that my parents were doing the best they could. And so I'm
Yeah.
not, what I'm about to say does not mean to throw them under the bus in any way. But my earliest grief memory is that our family dog, who was still kind of a puppy, like maybe 10 months old, we hadn't had him for all that long. He bit another child, one of my sister's friends, in the face, like sort of right under the eye. And so it was really awful. And then the next day when we got home from school, he had he had gone to a farm.
Yeah.
And
So the
so,
story goes, yeah.
yes. And so that was sort of the thing where, and then so where it was so like heartbreaking, like this thing had happened, but then also like, well, can we go visit him? Like all of these things. And so I didn't really realize until like much like well, probably well into adulthood that like none of our family pets like went to live on a farm.
They didn't actually go to a farm.
No, no. And so there was just that confusion. So it was like sadness, but also nothing to do around it because it wasn't truthful, like what had actually happened,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so I would say that my parents, my mom always was like tough cookie, stoic, keep going, that sort of thing. So that she modeled that over and over again throughout my life. And I had a deep, respect for her strength and that sort of thing. And my dad's was more, I think, avoidant. He was dependent on alcohol. And so I think that those were the two sort of ways to cope, like not
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
or just swallowing. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I know so many guests have shared some version of that story, pet loss in particular, but also just the way in which we were just sort of modeled. We're not going to talk about it. We're just going to move on. Life keeps going. That story. And I appreciate you naming that. Your parents were doing the best they can with what they had. And I know you shared a little bit in your own memoir that, your mom had to pick up and raise you and your sister. And she had to sort of embrace that sort of pull it togetherness as a single mom.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a real survival strategy. And so that was, as I was thinking about other early grief experiences, they were always so tangled in everything else that was going on, that I didn't even recognize it as grief because I had seen like probably from TV was where I was getting most of my information, like that grief is the sadness you feel when someone dies. And so we see that in like crying at the funeral, right?
Right,
Crying at
right.
the funeral
But
is
when the
grief.
dog disappears to a farm, there's no funeral to be crying at, for one
Right,
thing.
exactly. And so nothing else is grief
Yeah.
because
Or when you are separated from your father and right, that
yeah,
there isn't a, again, not a ceremony to be able to name.
right. And then and at that time, like when so my parents split up very suddenly, and that we it was like in the matter of a day we moved to a different place, and and thought it was temporary. And that's the other thing too, is like probably that was what like my mom thought too, but it turned out to not be temporary. And so there's the whole, yeah, just not knowing what to calibrate to. So I think that a lot of my early, like the dominant feeling was confusion. um
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe unearthed a little bit later on when profound losses happen. So, which we're going to dive into today. As I mentioned just a bit ago, the Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards, your memoir, is so compelling from page one because you both introduce us to this love story with your late husband, Sean, and also immediately into the complexity of the relationship and what it means to be the widow grieving this man. And I just wonder how you want to, I often ask when I interview somebody who feels very much, you know, the person died at the height of that person's happy emotional love relationship. And I know, as you speak about, like, you were already making a plan maybe by Christmas to end this relationship. So how do you want to bring Sean into the conversation, was all of that to
yeah.
say. Yeah.
Well, I think I'd like to start because, I really, I feel like our book titles are so simpatico, right? Like
I know.
Grief is a Steam and The
Right.
Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards. And so
Yeah.
there's a little bit of cheek in there.
Yeah.
But I
Yes.
think what I would like people to know off the top is that, yeah, my late husband, Sean, was someone that we were partners for 20 years in
Yeah.
life, and he was beloved by many people including me. And I think for anyone kind of looking in from the outside, they would have seen a charismatic, smart, funny, incredibly hardworking, successful person. They would have seen a solid partnership, like people really like teaming up and going through life together. um, and that's what it seemed for the most part for a long time. But just like with anything, I think, there's more there's more than we can
There's more.
see from the
Yeah.
outside, and there's also sometimes more than we're seeing on the inside of a relationship too. And so I was coming to a point where I was starting to see that Sean didn't seem to be well, that there were big fractures in the relationship that weren't being dealt with because he was so busy, and he was like really just devoting everything into his career, or so I thought. But in fact, he was devoting a lot to his career, but he was also keeping a lot of secrets from me. And so that's where the that's where the bastard part of the title comes
Yes.
in.
Yeah.
And when I found out, started to find out, was the day after his funeral. So he died suddenly of a heart attack. For a week it was that that the crying at the funeral
Right.
kind of
Right.
television
Right.
grief of the beloved. And then I started to find these things out, and it really changed the nature of my pain. It changed the nature of the relationship, and then what had to come after that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I wanted to offer that up because I know it, even as we work our way through your memoir, you sort of come to different ways. Like, we feel the anger with you, we feel the disappointment, we feel everything you've been feeling about Sean. And also, I appreciate the complexity of it all. Like, this is a person that you loved, and also a person who deeply wounded you and betrayed you, and is the father of your child, and to just be able to, I think it was interesting to, you helped us see how you could hold what seems like very contradictory things to be true all at once, which I think is such an important lesson for all of us, because so many of us hold those what seems like contradictory feelings about complex people and
Yeah.
complicated relationships. And yeah, so just, you had this whirlwind romance, you you all lived abroad. I think you met when you were working in Japan, and you moved back to Canada, and you moved to Singapore. But one of the things you start to let us know early on in the book was, though not officially diagnosed, what you took to be his charismatic behavior and his bigger than life personality and all those things really was an underlying bipolar diagnosis. Is that?
Yeah, I think that he was coping and managing with some undiagnosed bipolar disorder, and probably would have been mixed states bipolar, which I wasn't even
Yes.
really aware of
Yeah.
as a at the time. But yeah, I struggled a little bit with how to write about that, like both in terms of what to show, like the
Yes.
behaviors that I was seeing and how much to disclose, and then also in terms of how to make sense of it, because not being a mental health professional, like that sort of thing, I
Yeah.
didn't want to step out of my lane. But I do think that there's a lot, that's sort of, I don't know, because I live in Canada, and so our medical systems are maybe a little bit different. But here, the primacy of care is like to the individual, right? And so like privacy, like I
Yes.
was never like Sean did go to see a psychiatrist and came away without any sort of diagnosis or treatment plan or anything. But I felt like if they had asked like me, they might have got a more complete picture and that he might have been able to get some treatment. And I think there are probably a lot of people who are living in situations where
Yeah.
things seem not so good, but it's not exactly clear, like, how to
To the
get
outside
help.
world, or
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I really resonated so much with that. And I want to say I live in an American system, and I went with my husband to the head of psychiatry to tell all the other aspects of the story he wasn't telling. His cause, as it turned out later, was a grapefruit-sized brain tumor, but the behaviors looked very much the same. And even hearing everything that I said, their conclusion was wife unhappy with the division of labor in the household.
Lisa.
So I just, yeah,
I think
yeah.
my fists are clenching.
Yeah, yeah. So I say that to mean the like whichever side you're on, there's this frustration when you're seeing something or feeling something or experiencing something, particularly as a spouse, that doesn't seem right, but you don't have a label for it. But if when, the experts, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes here, intervene and then don't see what you're seeing. I wonder even back then when he came home, I mean, you write a little bit about it, but did you think, am I getting it wrong? Like, or did you know for sure, boy, that doctor just missed it? Or did it
I
make you
felt
question yourself?
abandoned. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I felt abandoned by the system. And how I felt is that the doctor probably was deceived, because
Yes.
I think, Sean was really smart, super personable. He could muster it
Charming.
for, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I think that the doctor saw what Sean wanted the doctor to see, and that was enough to satisfy him that he was okay, and then just proceeded as normal. And I will say, because there is that real, like, fracture between the line of, like, I'm sensing that something's wrong, and then I'm
Yes.
asking experts, I'm asking
Yes.
my partner, who it turns out is lying to me, but I trust them, so I believe what they're saying, and where I'm
Yes.
having to choose, am I going to believe the expert or trust what I'm feeling? And that every time I don't trust my feeling, like, something's happening. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I think that feeling's part of our immune system, and I think that it really creates the conditions of dis-ease in a
Yes.
family system. And so in that way, this is weird, and I did write about this. It was kind of edifying and satisfying when I started to find out the truth, because it was like,
Yeah.
I knew it. Like, I knew it. I knew it. So
Yes.
the part of me that's instincts were screaming finally got the satisfaction of having a fuller picture. But at the same time, and in the both end, it was horrifying to find that out, and that it really was true. So it created a weird kind of like elation and despair at the same time. But it helped me for all the times that I distrusted myself. Like, it helped me kind of patch over the part
Yeah.
of me that was prone to distrust myself, and help to build that back up, if that makes sense then to
Yeah.
you.
And you talk a little bit in the book, and I want, as you, again, you're a listener, so this is, I don't want us to be a voyeur, but also to the degree that you want to share some of the examples that you're talking about, because as you arrive at the day of widowhood and you don't find out about the betrayal till right after, there were things that were happening that were causing you to feel a certain way, as you were just talking about, and to be suspicious, to feel hurt, to feel scared. But then you couldn't quite make sense of it given what was happening, because there was some anger outbursts, there was some rage, there was some,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
leaving you. What did the life look like in those years up until maybe the 5, 10 years before his passing? And
Yeah, it's really complicated, but if I can just take, one of those threads, like say with the angry outburst.
yeah,
So that would be like textbook gaslighting, right? So it's
right.
like you're getting close, and then boom, it's just a big smoke show, like a big a big distraction, and that seems very disproportionate to the question, that I was at. And so
Yes,
like it pushes us back on our heels. It makes us like, and then have to be like, what did I do? How did, like, and so
yeah,
I think this kind of thing's happening societally all the
for
time.
sure, for sure.
And so anyone probably has had some experience of having, the rug yanked out from them just from asking like a simple question. So the question that you had asked is like, what was life like before? And so episodically, I think these kinds of things had happened in the marriage in a variety of ways over time, but they were becoming like sort of like
More
contractions when you're
frequent,
having a baby,
more
like
frequent and
more
more
frequent, closer
intense.
together, and
Yeah.
there was almost no level ground. And so I had come to the place where I realized like this is untenable. And
Because
I
he
was a,
was, let's be frank, he was threatening to leave the marriage many times. He was
only
throwing things
once.
or being
Yeah,
angry. Okay, it was that one time in the
just the
van,
one
maybe.
time, and that was
Yeah.
5 years before he died.
Okay.
And so, but that was the worst. Like, so 5 years before he died, there we went through a period where it was like that, and it was the worst that anything had ever been. And that's when he went to the psychiatrist, and that's when
Yes.
we did. We were on the road towards separating, and then something, happened, and we saw some counseling, and we ended up coming back together. And so then 5 years later, it was getting back to being that bad or worse, but it was complicated by the fact that he had taken a job in Denver, Colorado, and was
That's right.
commuting between Denver and Calgary. And so we weren't seeing like, and so then, he'd be home just say for the weekend. Well, you don't
Yeah.
want to burden down the weekend with a heavy conversation like this. And so I had decided that at Christmas, he'd be off for 2 weeks. We would have time to sit down and talk through, this is what I'm seeing. Things are not going well. You are obviously not coping well with all the stress that you're under. We need to deal with this. And if you can't get some help and support for your mental health, then I can't keep going with the way that we are. So I knew that it was bad, and that conversation would have happened in early December, but instead he died a month before that, on November 4th,
Yeah, in November.
2015.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you naming that, and also just wondering, when you look back on, I think when we think about losses, we think about the person that we lost, and then of course, hopefully, in this more grief literate culture that we're part of helping to create, we understand that we also grieve the future that won't be. I guess I want to ask at this point, when you look back at the Jessica who fell in love with Sean, you know, are there parts of you that grieve the marriage that you thought you were going to have versus the marriage that you had up until his death, and the difference there, and how you think about that?
Definitely over time there were times when I sort of thought like, when should I have jumped off of the train, the
Yeah.
Sean train?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And like, did I have opportunities that I missed? And could I have had a different and better life if I had been made a different kind of choice or decision? Um, and in some ways, that's like one of the central questions of the book, the story. Like, really, the question that I was most interested in is, can relationships heal beyond the veil of death? And I was interested in that because I was interested in my own healing, and like from reading your book, we have a lot of the
Yeah.
same influences: Gabor Mate, Brene Brown.
Yeah.
Like there are
Yeah.
lots of overlap with like where we've looked and found instructive things. And so I wanted to heal, but I also felt as though my whole life had been a lie, as though like this betrayal had wiped out anything that was ever good. All my memories were contaminated. This is how I was viewing it. And I just, and also, I'm going
Yeah.
to cry to saying this, but I'm not going to apologize for it. There could be hundreds of books written about the good man that Sean was and all the good things that he did, and that people loved him for legitimate reasons. He wasn't, someone who was completely sociopathic and just,
Yeah. Yeah.
creating a complete wake of destruction behind him. And so I felt a sense of a desire to reclaim like the both end
Yeah.
of his life and
Yeah.
also of our shared life and our relationship. And because some strange things started happening around my home and in my perception that didn't used to happen, I had to really also allow my worldview to open up to the possibility that maybe the like a rational materialist worldview that I used to hold wasn't all that there was, and maybe there was something there. And so anyway, so those are sort of the directions that I was looking in,
Yeah.
and that's part of why I wrote the story. I wrote what happened in order to try and make sense of it, and because I started to find out that even though the way that things stack up in my case is a bit anomalous, none of the constituent parts are rare, right? Like
Yeah.
most people have felt betrayal. Everyone
Yes.
experiences grief. Lots of
Yeah.
people feel some sort of sense of connection or some kind of uncanny, like, experience that didn't.
Visitation or yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's sort of.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I definitely want to talk more about how your life story unfolded. And to your point, 'cause sort of that bigger question that you're asking about healing and repairing a relationship sort of beyond the veil, as they say. But I wanted to make sure that I don't know, reframed or named that my question wasn't, why didn't you leave? The question was, do you ever sort of hold dear in your heart? I always think about the hands on your heart. Oh, sweetie, how could it be any other way? Like that version of you who had entered a marriage thinking it was going to be one thing and not the other, and just sort of holding that tender, I think was the question. And I want to name what you just said because I think it's so important, which is, can you talk a little bit about once you found the betrayal, which it turns out Sean had been having multiple affairs and having other relationships in the marriage, how you first versus how now you deal with looking back, talk about a loss, like what was my life even? Because the story of
Yeah,
my life is very different, well, or added, or there's different new piece chapters now to a story of my life I already had a story written about,
yeah,
meaning what your life and marriage was, but now you're finding these things out. What was that like at first, and how has that changed or shifted over time?
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just to go back, basically, like my life with Sean, like what I thought our marriage would be, I didn't really have a picture of what that would be. And so I just thought
Yeah.
it would be a joyous adventure, or a wild, I should say a wild adventure, because, and it really was that, like even to the
Yeah.
end. And you know,
Yeah.
so that part I kind of did get what I bargained for. But the part of the betrayal and finding these things out that hurt the most, and where I've had to, I circle around it a lot of times to kind of make some sort of shift, is that I was pouring love into this human being, into this relationship, up until the moment that I found out that things weren't, and what I thought I was contributing to was our team, right? Like our, like the
Yes.
success of this relationship. And some of my love, care, sustenance was being used against me, right? Right? Like diverted into these other relationships. And like one of the things that I found was hidden secret debt, and that he'd accumulated like tens of thousands of dollars, and a lot of that was spent on entertaining other women. And then in his death, I had to pay for that, right? And so that's a very good metaphor for how like the flow of the relationship was going, and that feeling of betrayal. And so I still feel a little bit angry when I think about
Yeah.
that, but I had to allow my anger. And that's one of the things that happens, like, not early, it's kind of just towards probably the middle of the book, but in the time frame, it was only about 6 weeks into finding this out, that I actually executed a revenge plan on someone, um, in yeah, in a desire to, I think, force some kind of accountability, or to kind of just rebalance the scales. Like, I felt like I had been so deceived and such a sucker and so taken advantage of. And I just was like, screw
And
that.
Sean wasn't here to
Yes.
direct your anger to him. Yeah. So
Yeah.
listeners, I mean, I'm not here to support, deny, or whatever, but I have to say it was pretty amazing. Your revenge plan was confronting, both telling the husband and confronting his lover, that you knew what was happening, and by BT dubs, you weren't the only one, and go get yourself some STD testing. By the way, I have to say, I was cheering a little bit audibly when I read that chapter in the book, and I'm glad we get to have a little chuckle here. But I did want to read something about, because I think it was maybe in that time frame, but something that you and your therapist at the time were talking about around anger, because I think whether or not you're grieving a loss that involves betrayal, anger is such a common emotional experience in our grief. And it's the most denied, I think, especially to women. And anger, like all emotions, but anger needs to move and needs to be discharged. And again, we're not advocating revenge plans, but that was one way. But you did talk, you had this really interesting conversation you shared in the book. If it's okay, I'd love to just
Yeah,
share it with our
please.
listeners, this little
Sure.
excerpt, because I thought it was just a really interesting reminder to all of us when anger shows up at our door, which is going to show up at our door at one time. Your therapist had said to you, okay, so would you say the quality of your anger is different today? And I stopped to consider. My rage usually feels like a white hot coal in the pit of my stomach. Right now, it's volcanic. Well, I'm spewing. Yeah, she laughs. Until today, you haven't shown much anger in session, but you've told me you were mad at Sean. Today, you're mad for him. There's a shift there. What a breakthrough, a different flavor of bile, you said. I can imagine a little sarcastically. She said, just keep tracking your anger. If we can move it, it can move out. I take out my debit card, wondering how much difference any of this makes. I also appreciated this. I feel better in the room with someone listening to me, but as soon as I walk out, I'm back in the woods. Counseling is like setting a broken bone. It doesn't take the pain away, but it puts things in place so eventually they'll heal properly. It's hard to be patient with the process. I could be tracking my anger for a long time.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
That I really, another one thing that I love about your podcast is that you talk about, like, how important talk therapy can be, and
Yeah.
also that there's more. Like, it's,
Necessary, but not sufficient for
yeah,
most of us,
yeah,
right? It's a place to start. And
yeah, yeah. And so, like, with the revenge thing, and with the, like you said, anger is such an active emotion, and it really, I'm so grateful now that for the things that it helped me do to keep moving. And
yeah,
then,
because it is initiating, and it's action, and it's around injustice, and we want that, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it feels powerful because there is some sort of, like, probably, like, in my case, in that situation, it was like a reclamation of my agency. Like, like, talking
Yes.
about agency is one of the things, like, in your book, that I love.
Yeah.
It's just like underline, underline, underline.
Yes.
Um,
It's
and
so critical.
yeah, yeah, and but then after that, like, to a point, without, like, really spoiling, because it's probably the same trajectory for most people who have done sort of some sort of revenge. It's a temporary satisfaction, and you can't really stop there. And so for me, once I had taken all the actions that I could and my anger was still there, I realized what the stakes were for my life, because if I didn't do something, I was going to become bitter and resentful and be probably distrustful and lonely forever. And I didn't want that for myself. And so that's sort of the leap that I make into the second half of the book, which is like starting to look for some sort of healing and some sort of way to reconcile what had happened.
Yeah, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about moving from the place of being with the feelings and using talk therapy and friends. And I know your brother-in-law, at least one of them, Ty, you had different people you talked to, and but that over time you recognized that there were other ways in which you needed to metabolize. It's one way I think about it, your grief, your betrayal, your hurt. So I want to hear about that, but I don't often get to have other widows on the show who also had, a betrayal or had this difficult end to the marriage, in that way. And I wonder, you do touch on in the book, um, you know, there's just something you said in the book that I just wanted to name. I don't even know if I have a question for you, but just the 6-month window that
Yeah.
widows get as a permission, and then everything else is you are the, I don't know, whatever. You're the dangerous woman.
Destabilizer. Yeah.
You're
Threat.
the destabilizer, the threat around everyone. And you talk about, I think it was your sister-in-law or somebody sort of made a side comment that really wounded you. And you shared a conversation you had with your mom who said, oh yeah, I warned you, you have 6 months. And I feel like 13 years later, I still feel that way, I mean, I'm single, so I guess if I was in a relationship, I wouldn't feel as much of a threat to other people. But I've had friendships and male friendships that were sunsetted because even though I've never shown that behavior. So I
I
just
know.
wonder now over time, like, what did it feel like in that moment to be a threat? And in case I wasn't making it clear, listeners, it's sort of like we become the suspicious ones,
Yeah, my mom
to
said
the
people
wives and
my mom
girlfriends.
said people will be nice to you for 6 months and then they'll start seeing you as a threat. And my mom, like, she lived with like a lot of people, like more like I would call it like more of a golden girl culture. Although I'm realizing now that I'm kind of like in the age bracket of the actual golden
I
girls,
know.
but like I thought older, in a retirement sort of community. And so I just thought, oh,
This
sorry
is
that
just
happened to
that
you, mom,
era.
but this is just that generation or something like that. But no, it was also true. And like, so it feels so how I feel about it is I understand, territoriality, jealousy, that sort of thing, but I felt very unseen or unrecognized, like you're saying. Like it's like I feel like as someone who would be your friend, would I would hope that they would see you and see your intentions and understand, and allow that you could have friendships and that you and to not. Yeah, and so there's something culturally that's very unhealthy about seeing like a single person as like a free radical that's just out
Yeah.
there to like wreck all of the stability of the marriages or something like that.
I also, though, wonder for you, having been on the other side of people cheating on you, do you think maybe especially confronting or affronting or disrespectful? You're like, I'm not the one who's been out here cheating. Did
Yeah,
it feel like maybe, I mean, it's hard to know
kind
because
of,
it
because
was
it's like,
just
yeah,
you,
I
but like,
did. Like it's like, yeah, I know I'm being punished for something that I didn't do and I've shown myself to be faithful, right? Because anyway, but that doesn't. I think people they're acting on their feelings of
yes. Yeah.
their own
Yeah.
insecurities, not what
Yeah.
we're doing.
And I wonder too, so that we were referencing sort of a riff, a little bit of a rift of, I believe, one of your sister-in-laws who didn't feel so great about you spending one-on-one time with your brother-in-law. And yet you do talk in the book really beautifully about the way, I think at least one, maybe it's Ty, but I'm not sure if I'm remembering everybody's names correctly. A lot of people, our losses have so many secondary losses because when we lose particularly a partner, sometimes the in-laws or the relations fade away for either out of contention or just different lifestyles or those things. But I can remember a conversation that you had with your brother-in-law of like, I'm going to be your friend for life. I'm here. And because you told him, I think you had to be the one to tell him about his brother's infidelity and the behaviors that had happened in the marriage. And he assured you that, I'm here for you and for Dash. Can you tell me a little, had you worried that they were going to also disappear? What does that mean to you to still have his family or some of his family anyways in your life?
Yeah, I was really worried about that because we had lived, so Sean was one of his five siblings and they all lived in the same city, and that was our, holidays and family network and cousins. I have one sister, but we didn't live in the same place. And so anyway, it was to me, if we lost my in-laws, we were losing the whole infrastructure of our lives. And
Holidays and birthdays
yeah,
and yeah,
yeah. And
yeah.
so I really worked hard to make sure that we could, like, that hope that we would still be, welcome to participate in that way, that Dash would still, be like, get know his cousins and know his aunts and uncles and all of that. And so that was super important to me. And I felt, yeah, so there was, I think, a couple things that I did. um I don't really want to talk about it
Yeah,
because
that's fine.
I feel so embarrassed. But like in this story, like, I reveal some of Sean's bad behavior and some of my own, like things that I'm not proud of that I did.
Yes.
And there's a point where I'm like, if anyone knows that I did this, I will be like
Then
excommunicated
I
from
will
the family.
excommunicate it from
Yeah,
family.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that was like a huge risk. But they really, to a person, were unwaveringly supportive of my healing in the writing of the story. And so I'm extremely grateful for the support that they poured in over those years. And now Dash is just became an adult. So, so I feel like his relationships with all his cousins and aunts and uncles kind of moves into his court now, right? Like as we do.
Yes, yes, for
Um,
him to choose. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Do you think there was something in particular you did well or that you're proud of in terms of working to keep those relationships going? I'm just wondering, as people might be listening and are, maybe wanting to reach out to the in-laws because they maybe feel hurt that they haven't checked on them, but don't know how to step into. I mean, I lost all of Eric's family. That's a story for another day, but I know so many people struggle with, how do we nurture that, and who goes first in saying what they need, and any
Yeah.
lessons from your own?
It's interesting because I do think, like, I love how you talk about this in your book too, about like being able to ask for what you need. And that I think that so many of the frictions are about like the primacy of need, right? Like, and who,
Yeah.
like, I
Yeah.
remember, this is a digression, but just Maura McInerney's, it was a Facebook group to start out with, Hot Young Widows Club,
Yes.
had just
Yes. Yeah.
started when I was widowed and I was part of that. And I remember watching like these really like, gut wrenching battles between a young widow and the mother of her
Yeah.
husband over the ashes. Just like, and just because it's a question of like, who does he belong to, right? Like, just like this
Yeah.
awful
Yeah.
thing. And there's no good way to resolve that kind of
Yeah.
question if you're looking at it from that framework. And I think this is where, yeah, all relationships are sort of negotiating a primacy of need, and not
Yeah.
everybody can see each
And
other's
do you
point
have
of
the
view.
capacity to have empathy for the other when you're so wounded and feeling so lost or betrayed
Yeah,
yourself? And I know
yeah.
you talk a lot about, your work to find empathy, and how important
Yeah,
that has been
and
in your
so
own
with
healing journey.
with my sister-in-law Jen, I can see when she made that comment, like she was feeling on the outside,
Yeah.
right? And and
Yeah.
so it was a like I don't blame her for
Yeah.
for like how she felt or what she was seeing, because it was true. I was taking a lot of her husband's time,
Yeah.
and as he was supporting me, there she was on the outside. And so it, I, as far as, I guess I would sort of say to anyone who's like in a contentious or difficult situation with their in-laws, to try to feel like clear about like why you want the relationship, and if you have the capacity to make the relationship happen, and to understand that if for whatever reason it can't, like, you can still get support. Like, there's found family.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's hard to
Yeah.
have those other things, but you're not going to be alone if you don't have those
Yeah.
particular people.
Yeah. And also, I also say, some people don't know how to show up, so they don't show up. And, we don't necessarily have to write people off. People just might not be able to be there for that season too. And to your point, how can we then turn into chosen family or friends to find the kinds of people who are capable of supporting us. And for many of us, in-laws and others might not be the first line of support because they're so wounded too that they need to be the center of their concentric circle of grief support, and that it's too hard.
Yeah.
I think that's surprising to so many people. You think, oh, we all lost the same person, so we're going to lean on each other. And that does happen sometimes, but sometimes, more often than you would think, those aren't the spaces of support because so many people are so wounded and they need to feel the center of the gaze of support from other people.
Yeah.
Does that ring
Yes.
true for you? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you shared really honestly the beauty and the fun parts about your relationship with Sean, and also the way that likely his undiagnosed bipolar disease and then his behaviors caused so much friction. And just after the funeral, as you said, thankfully, in a way, you didn't discover till after everybody got to get up and say something beautiful. Pornography and all the things and the affairs. And you started some of the typical routes of, I think you took Dash to a group therapy, and you were doing being with moms, and you had talk therapy, and I saw you went to Camp Widow, right? And these things. What did you start to understand, either because of your anger or other things, that led you to explore other kinds of places or spaces of healing? Like what were those places, and what have you learned over time?
So I've had back problems all my life, but I was having like a lot of like physical, holding
Yeah.
tension, like those kinds of symptoms. And so I was starting to see, go for massage or different kinds of body work. And then strangely, the people who were working on me were getting like intuitive hits and telling me about them. So that was like a really strange thing that used to, but anyway, so just because of how I was physically feeling, I was seeing therapists that worked in with the body. And
Yeah.
then through
Are you talking
them,
about like craniosacral therapists or?
craniosacral therapists, just straight up massage therapists. But there's one scene you probably can be
Yes.
reminded where I went for a massage, and then it
And she
turned
was
out
weeping.
yes.
Is
So
that the one where she was?
the massage therapist was weeping, but I thought she was. I could just hear her sniffling, so I thought she was sick, and I'm like, ah, great. But it turned out she was crying because the energy, she said, you have so much trauma and grief stored in your body, it's making me tear up. And I'm like, oh no, like, I'm sorry that you have to feel it. And she's like, no, I don't feel it, but I work with energy. And so if you want, I can help you release it. And so I'm like, okay, but I didn't
You
really know what I was agreeing to. So like, that's an example of how, I worked with an energy worker accidentally. And
Yes.
it really did like cause a tremendous shift in how I felt immediately after. And I'm like, wow. And so I became curious. And so then I would, one thing kind of led to another. And so it was sort of like following a breadcrumb trail of what was effective, not so much about what I like. I kind of had to get over what I believed to
Yeah, I
just
was just
follow
about
the
to
efficacy,
say,
if that
were
makes
you able
sense.
to be not necessarily not be maybe a skeptic or a cynic about it, but also maybe were you following it not necessarily knowing what the hopeful outcome was, but you were just trying to stay tuned to like, did I feel better or worse after
Yeah,
each
yeah.
encounter?
It
Yeah.
was just sort of that, like, take a step. Did this make me feel better or worse? Better. Okay, let's go that way.
Yeah.
Um,
Which I think is so important. I wanted to sort of name that as, of course, we always like to think we're going to enter into something because we know A plus B equals C, and then we're going to end up here. And then that can be really overwhelming, whether we're in early grief or any place in our grief. And as I've talked about before, if we can just start close in and just then take one's action and then do exactly what you just named that you did, which was like, you know, litmus test. Do I feel better or worse? Okay, a little bit better. Do I need to know why? No. Okay, well, let me try a little bit more of this or explore into that next thing. Do you think that was just out of sheer desperation and needing to feel better, or did you have a real awareness that, you know what, I'm just going to go on this journey and be in an exploring space?
I think it was a little bit good fortune, just lucky that I was lucky to
Yeah.
fall into something. But I also think, like, per what we were saying before about like patching up the holes in my intuition. that as I
Yes.
was tending that part of me, like I'd be like, oh, I knew it. It started to be like, okay, if you get that feeling again, believe yourself, And so I was
Yes.
really trying to tend my intuition and listen. And so I was following that more than following the rules of
The rules
what,
or logic.
yeah,
Something just really washed over me when you said that, and I don't know if this is a direction you wanna go in the remaining time that we have together, but what struck me, which feels so true, not again just to loss that is tinged with betrayal and trust issues, but to all losses, and it felt so true to me, maybe because I'm also a trauma survivor, is really what the healing journey was for you was, of course, acts of agency, which we share as a passion, but really about reclaiming and healing your intuition
yeah,
and
that
learning to listen to the deeper inner knowing of you that had been cleaved by all the betrayal and just the loss. Does that ring true?
that definitely rings true, and it also speaks to why writing was such a help, like, because
Yeah.
it's like that's the thing that can kind of it does a few things, right? Like it slows things down. It lets you take things one at a time and untangle them. It lets you get them out of your head. And then it lets you feel like to start to feel that connection with, and to feel, for me at least, like revitalized in a way as I was starting to be able to partially admit truths, like admit certain truths that I've been maybe denying from myself, and then also kind of hold things with a bit more gentleness, like whatever it is, like even if it's rage, like I can be as rageful as I want and and then look at it, right, right, because I have a little bit of distance, and then like be gentle with the part of me that's rageful, instead of being like, stop being so mad, stop being so ugly, stop being, like
Yeah.
all of
The
those.
denying or the pushing away
Yeah,
of those
yeah,
things. Yeah.
yeah.
It sounds like for you, writing became sort of a safe container to set down what you were experiencing, but also then to be in relationship with your grief, your anger, your frustration, your betrayal in a way that didn't totally take you over.
Yes. And then the next step of that was starting to share writing with like other people and
Yeah.
read, and so through a course. And so I feel like I sort of have started to think about, like, I said to someone just casually in a different kind of conversation, have you ever been at a child's birthday party where like these are little kids and one gives the present to the birthday child and the birthday child opens it, and then the kid that gave it, like they've been so excited because they know what's under there, and then they can't wait for them to open it, and then they want to like take it back and play with it, right? Like, and so then there ends up being like a fight and tears and whatever. And it's like
Yeah.
we can't share something until it's ours. And so what I've kind of realized, like with myself, with grief, pain, whatever, it's like first it's a direct injury to me, like right to my body, that I need to
Yeah.
like feel and tend. And then once it's mine, like once it's mine enough that I've lived it, I can sort of let it move into, like, transmute it into the greater experience. And and so how I do that is like, I don't, because grief is too big for us to hold in our bodies. So
Yes.
massive, like it shreds us. Like I feel that's why it's a bitch. That's the bitch part, right? But I feel like it's supposed to move through. And so after it's been mine, then I can release it. And so that, and then I start to reconnect with the world. And so that's what, the writing process can mimic that, where it's like, you know it's mine, I see it, and now I can share it, and now it goes to the world. And so that's why I see it as such a technology of healing.
Yeah. How do you think about the relationship, or do you think about this as a relationship between the writing and now talking about it and continuing to trust in your own intuition and the importance of intuition in your life? Do those things connect?
Yeah. And so I don't know if I can answer like in the big picture of how I think
Yeah.
about it, but I can tell you how I'm acting on it.
Yes,
Um,
please.
which is like, a lot of people are asking me, so what are you writing your next book right now? And
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
was
yeah.
like, no, I am not writing another book right now, because my intuition told me that this book would require some kind of like aftercare, like, and
Yeah.
that it would bridge to other people wanting to share their stories with me, and that I needed to reserve some part of me
Space.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, to just sort of hear what people were sharing and respond if I can, and that sort of thing. And that has definitely been happening, and it's shown me what you said off the top so astutely. These betrayals are not uncommon, but it's uncommon to talk about them because there's so many barriers in the way of that. And so for all the hard days and anguish and time that I wanted to quit, I'm really glad that I went through with the writing and sharing of this story because of what's coming back. Um, it was worth it just for that.
That's so powerful. There's so many places I want to go, and I know we're getting to the end of our time. We might sneak a little few extra minutes because there's just still so many questions that I have for you. But have you thought, or can you share a little bit about what it's meant to, I think we hear so often, don't speak ill of the dead, you know, and, but then I think often then about the ways in which then we have to hold that then we have to hold the secrets, that we have to hold the suffering, that we have to hold the trauma, and that we pay the cost for that, and it transmutes, and that there's the either or, keep the secret or be a bad person and destroy somebody's legacy or memory. And I wonder, now that we're, the book's been in the world, you sounds like your family, his family, has been supportive, but what have you learned, or what you want our listeners to know? And again, it doesn't have to be in the form of a memoir, but about what it's meant to speak ill of the dead, and or even just that phrase, and what
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
learned
I've
about it.
thought a lot about that phrase because I really do hold that we all deserve dignity and respect, and especially, maybe not even especially in death, but that we should be careful. Like I
Yeah.
feel like to
Yeah.
handle legacy, questions of legacy, with a lot of care. And so to answer like how I think about it now, I agree wholeheartedly with what you said, that there's a cost to keeping secrets, and that so in my life I might set a certain chain of events into motion. That motion doesn't stop just because I've died, right? And so
Right.
if suddenly the consequences are happening, but now there's some kind of cone of silence about being able to talk about the origin, or how it kind of transformed, like that's a real problem. And so I don't, and I also wonder the origin too. Do you know what I mean? Like I
Yeah.
can see there's respect, but I'm also like, did people think that they would come back and haunt us if we did? Do you know what I mean? Like I
Yeah.
really wonder, like, what, how did this become like the dominant thing that we could only ever say this? And I don't think it serves the person who died or their legacy or memory to not be held in some kind of truth. And I don't think it serves the people who are still living. And I think that that model of is that there's some kind of switch that when the person dies, the relationship is over. And so we have to
Yeah.
like lock it in time. Now, from now on, only ever this. And I'm like, I don't think that
On a
that,
pedestal too.
yes,
Yeah.
on a pedestal. And I don't think that part of the over is true. And so I think because that's not true, then the rest of the flow of everything needs to be able to keep flowing. And I think that that allows a lot more flexibility in how we relate.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Meaning they're dead, but we are still in relationship with them in some ways, with the consequences, and I don't mean that negatively either. The impact of them having been in our lives will live with us as long as we're alive. So then how do we continue to make meaning of the connection that we had, and how we want that to show up in our life going forward?
Yeah, and the other thing is, like I spoke earlier about how liberating I found the truth. I can imagine that in some ways that would also be liberating for Sean. I can imagine that he was expending a tremendous amount of energy to keep these secrets, and that it was like I think that contributed to his death,
Yeah.
and so that I can imagine that what a relief, to have these things revealed and to still be able to be held with love, and to be maybe held with love fully for the first time by someone who knows like all of these other things about you. Like there's a lot of promise in that idea, which I'm not saying it is or isn't that way, but to
Yeah.
think about it that way, it just, I don't know, it gives me,
Shifts your relationship with how it is that you give yourself permission to speak your truth into the world and to speak that experience into the world.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if this is where I want to end because I'm not sure if this feels like even a resonant word for you, but I don't think I can have somebody on the show who's experienced such profound betrayal in their lives and ask you to share with us your insights or wisdoms or thoughts on the notion of forgiveness and how that's, if that means something to you, how that showed up, what it means to you even just today, which might not be what it means if we talk in a year from now.
Yeah, thanks for allowing it to be flexible. But
Yeah.
for me, the number one thing I would say off the top about forgiveness is that it's not a moral imperative. No one has to forgive anyone else. And in my experience, I tried to will myself to forgive because I believed that it would be liberating for me. I believe that forgiveness is something we do for ourselves. And so I'm like, forgive,
Yes. Well,
forgive,
that's what they say
forgive.
out there, right? You're
Yeah,
carrying around the weight, and if you're only suffering yourself if you're carrying the weight.
yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so I'm like, okay, I want to not have it wait. And so let me forgive. But I couldn't make myself forgive. And then I got mad about not being able to. And so what I did instead of, well, not instead of, in addition to trying to force myself to forgive, was I acted on some anger, took
Yeah.
another step, and then I allowed the trajectory after the discharge of anger to keep moving forward. I didn't stay in like
Stay
revenge mode
stuck in an anger
forever.
loop. Yeah.
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 And what happened was that I got some clarity. And what the clarity allowed for me to sort of see a shared experience. And I write about this. I'm not being vague, intentionally, but like I write about like that I found, like say, with the example of this other woman, I found an experience that we shared. And seeing her in the light of the shared experience gave me a sense of common humanity. And when I had that, it's kind of like forgiveness washed over. So I couldn't make it happen or control it, but I could create the conditions of forgiveness, or at least that forgiveness didn't seem to be required, or at least required of me. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well, that idea of that there's this moral imperative and that we have to forgive, that we can muscle our way into it. But it sounds to me, one of the things you're saying is, and I talk about this all the time, like we don't get to have one emotion without the other. And anger was needing your attention for a while. And
Yeah.
you, for one thing, really needed to be with your anger and discharge it and move with it for a while, for one thing. And sometimes we want to skip to the one emotion, but we really have to move through something else first. And also that you showed up with a kind of an opportunity presented itself for you to dig deep into the well of compassion.
Yeah. And so that's where I think like there's something where maybe when we get to compassion, forgiveness is not like irrelevant, but
Yeah.
compassion is the source of it and then the thing. But interestingly, as people have responded to the book, and I don't, they say don't read reviews, but this is my first book, so I was
Yeah.
definitely
Yeah.
reading them at the beginning. It was really interesting to see how people related to the story on around forgiveness. Like a lot of people, like people, especially for people who don't like this book, a lot of them don't like it because they think that I was too unforgiving and that I should have never done anything, or that I was too forgiving and I should have. And so it's really interesting, like to see, like I'm saying that these people are showing me something about themselves, like in how
I was
they're,
just about to
yeah,
say, yeah. So showing them something about themselves and also something about our cultural norms and rules about
yeah.
the moral imperative of forgiveness or not, or, the righteousness of standing your ground for your own. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also, I guess just to wind up the last thing because it feels important to say, I don't think that forgiving is letting anyone off the hook. Like I think that consequences and accountability is a super important component to that, and I think that's one of the things that makes it hard. Like when you find out after the person has died, and you're like,
Yeah.
what? Because
Yeah.
all the channels of accountability that I knew of are not available to me right now. And so, anyway, so yeah, it's in living or death. It's complicated, but yeah, there's a real journey with forgiveness. That's
Yeah.
for sure.
Well, I so appreciate you walking us there at the end of our conversation today because again, whether it's, infidelity in marriage, there's so many people grappling with the fact that they didn't get to resolve maybe old hurts or wounds, in their lives and to I think just demystify the fact that you can, therapy or muscle your way into forgiveness and it's really just about following the intuitive path of your own journey and making space as you said, with some of these different healing modalities and writing and all the things to allow to come through you what needs to come through and then maybe you might get to a place of holding sort of sacred the fact that we're all perfectly flawed humans living perfectly flawed lives and then what do we want to do with this life that we have, it feels to me is the place that you're arriving today.
So
Yeah.
beautifully said. Thank you for
well
winding us
y-
up that way.
well thank you, Jessica, so much for being in conversation with me today. I hope it's not our last, and listeners, I am telling you, The Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards, Jessica Waite. I'll have the link in my show notes for today's episode. It's truly, I mean, besides just being expertly written and intriguing, it's just a moving story that even if it's not like that was not the story that I had, but there were so many places that I was relating and nodding and made me even think about some fellow grievers in my life and how I might show up to them differently too. So I just thank you so much for gifting us your story in this book. And we appreciate you. Thanks for joining me on Grief as a Sneaky Bitch.
Thank you so much, Lisa. What a dream come true to be with you. Thank you.